As we enter into the High Middle Ages, this is a period of time where we see much more prosperity taking place. When things are prospering, things are going well, people start to look around and they start to wonder what they can make better. So the High Middle Ages is a period of time that is very much marked by both prosperity and reform. In regards to prosperity, we see Europe really sort of surging ahead in so many different places. So again, we can't really refer to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, can we? But we see Europe surging ahead, mostly commercially. Now, commerce is not new to the Europeans, but the commercial revolution brought about the future of European success. Now, why is that? Well, because to Europeans, wealth equaled power. And medieval, so sorry, just, just got finished eating something that's like stuck in my throat. Medieval European cities were the centers of both production and economic activity. So with this continual development of urban centers, we see a huge increase in commercial growth. Now, what helps to set Europe apart? It's a couple of different things. One is mechanical power. To start off with, water and wind were harnessed to power different mills and to make different things happen, right? Different machinations need some sort of force. Well, if you're not going to use water and wind, what else can you use? Well, you can use muscle. You can use either people muscle or the more preferred animal power, beasts of burden. With the desire for power comes the need to improve upon the different techniques used. So in animal power, for example, there was a new type of harness that could be used on oxen, and they began to use oxen as opposed to horses as beasts of burden, because horses could break their necks, and you have to, care for horses in a particular way. Their stomachs can get jacked up if they eat the wrong things, all that kind of stuff. And so oxen tended to be the beast of burden of choice. Now, with these new types of, or not necessarily new, but improved and more efficient uses of mechanical power from water, wind, and animals, we also see new agricultural techniques. The three-field cultivation techniques required you to plant one section of land in spring, plant one section of land in fall, and you leave the other section of land fallow for a year. And fallow means you don't use it, right? You leave it alone. You allow the ground to replenish itself of the nutrients necessary. With the three-field cultivation technique, we start to see an increase in the quality of life, as it were. People are producing more food, more different kinds of food, and so a population increase takes place because people are not undernourished or malnourished, and they are and food is readily available to them. As part of this commercial revolution, when you are growing and things are prospering, things are looking good, we start to see trade taking place. Fairs, probably the most famous of which are the Champagne fairs in France. These fairs allowed increased trade between various people groups. You would see people from as far away as Scandinavia or from India bringing their wares to these different types of places. And maybe not necessarily those people in particular, but people who purchased those foreign or exotic goods, bringing them to the fair. And I like this tapestry because this tapestry shows us that you would come in and you would buy, much like we have our festivals in Louisiana, you'd buy a booth and you could sell your wares from that booth. And it could be food, it could be clothes, it could be weaponry, maybe, it could be animals. And look, right at the center, sort of representative of the Pope here, he's giving his blessing on what's taking place. The church is behind you 100%. So, for example, at the Champagne fairs, again, probably the most famous, we see silks, woolen fabrics, furs, leather, and various food delicacies, including the wonderful spices coming from the East. And bankers also begin to encourage currency exchanges, which is only going to bring in more wealth to European cities. So European cities are growing and growing and growing and growing, not just in people, but in wealth, because of attracting various goods, attracting the desire for these foreign or exotic goods. Now, with prosperity, we see a desire to change things, to make them better, right? To make them more efficient, to make them different. For one thing, because you have the time. If you don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, you can start thinking about other things. You can start thinking about things that you like to think about. And some people like to think about architecture, right? So we see at the early Middle Ages and in late antiquity, we see the Romanesque style of church. These were meant to be houses of prayer. This is where you would hear the Gregorian chants, those beautiful those beautiful prayers that were sung in Latin. It's a very serious place. When you went there, you went to worship, and worship was not going to be, jumping off the pews or anything like that. You went there as a solemn act of worship. Rounded arches with very little light. You put as many windows as you can, but you're not going to have very much light. In the High Middle Ages, we see the Gothic form of architecture coming about. And with the Gothic, cathedrals are really known for a couple of different things. One, they're pointed arches as opposed to the rounded Roman-looking arches. We've got pointed arches, lots and lots and lots of light, and flying buttresses, or those big braces that we see on the outside. And these are meant really to help support the walls, because they have these very delicate stained glass windows, and just glass in particular, that we need to make sure it doesn't crack and cave in on itself, that kind of stuff. Now, stained glass windows were meant to depict life around your community or Bible stories. And this was a wonderful way for people to teach Bible stories, because once again, the vast majority of all people in Europe at this time are illiterate. And so you could use the stained glass windows and tell the story of the gospel. The church ultimately became the religious, the social, and the commercial focal point of a city. Why? Because it's in the center. And at the center of town is where you're going to have your fairs, right? You go there for church. So there's our commercial and there's our religious. But also, again, with it being the center of the city, that's where you're going to go probably to mill about and to walk about, right? But the Gothic architecture was really meant to be a foretaste of heaven. The stained glass windows were meant to bring in all different types of color, and it's still a solemn act of worship, but it was meant to provide you with that sort of glimpse into heaven. But churches were also where you would go to be educated. All around you can see all the little dots on here. Those represent the medieval universities. And a university would have been housed inside the church. During the High Middle Ages, we see the development of scholasticism. The scholastics, once again, probably the most well-known is Thomas Aquinas. At least in our circles, we refer to Thomas Aquinas. These are Christian theologians and philosophers. These guys, as I have on the slide, they're trying to make sense of their world through reason. If they made sense of their world through reason, ultimately they saw this as leading them to God. So if I can look around and I can understand how the world works, how plants grow, how nutrients allow my body to grow from an infant to a toddler, from a toddler to a young child, from a young child to an adolescent, from an adolescent to an adult, and then to see the deterioration process happening. This is not new knowledge. Like, we see this, we know, we eat, we will continue to grow. Good things will continue to grow. This is not new knowledge, but it was meant to deepen the respect and understanding what was already there, to see that faith and nature could not contradict each other. Now, these are sort of like professional thinkers, okay? They want to sit around and think, as it were. Thomas Aquinas once wrote, "Our intellect is led by our senses, by what we see, taste, smell, hear, touch, to divine knowledge." And what is divine? To godly, right? Our intellect, our smarts, is led by our senses to knowledge of God. Now, Thomas Aquinas was not the popular kid. He was always thinking. He was very, very thoughtful, not in the sense of considerate. I mean, he may have been considerate, but just always thinking through things. To give you an example, there's a story of him in a classroom, and his classmates went running to the window, and they said, "Thomas, come here, come here. There's a bull flying right outside the window." And Thomas got up, and he went to the window to look, and they all started laughing, and they said, "Oh, Thomas, you're so gullible." And he turned around and looked at them, and he said, "I'm not gullible. I would rather believe a bull is flying than my brother in Christ would lie to me." Snap. So, not necessarily the popular kid. And most of the time, you're highly smart, very, very smart, intelligent people are not. But anyway, that's besides the point. As he gets older, he starts reading his sort of his pinnacle work, the Summa Theologica. In this work, we see descriptions of the world, descriptions of humanity, of the heavens being the skies, as well as the nature of God. And what's interesting about this is that he never finished it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's interesting in it, but he never finished it because he received a vision from God, and he said it was just so beautiful. Words simply were not enough to describe it. So, just really, really, really interesting guy. He'd be a neat guy to meet in heaven. We also start to see some reform taking place within the government. Just to give you one example of this, over in England, what's happening in England? Well, in the year 1066, we see a conquest of England by William of Normandy, and he's then becomes known as William the Conqueror. Within his line, generations later, we see Henry II, who marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful and wealthy woman in her own right. Now, these two particular events are rather important for England because it brings parcels of land from France. William of Normandy. Now, if you think about World War II, storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, what is that? We were going into France, right? So William of Normandy, he's got land in France, and he conquers England. Land in France, and he conquers England. Is he going to give up that land in France? No. So years and years later, Henry II marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Where is Aquitaine? Aquitaine's in France. Yeah, like this is going to cause problems later on. Keep that in the back of your mind. So we see between Henry and Eleanor, who was Queen of France, and they divorced. She marries Henry, and she winds up having lots of children. She had no children with the King of France. We see probably the most well-known sons, Richard the Lionheart, you know, the guy from Robin Hood, and John. John the Landless, I think maybe is what someone called him, but he's basically just John. Richard the Lionheart led in crusades. He spent over his reign, he spent maybe less than a year actually in England. Considered a very good king, or you know, at least a decent one. And then John came along. John was not a good king. John taxed the nobility and took away certain privileges of the nobility that really started to tick them off. And so the barons rebelled against John and forced John to sign a very important document, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which set the precedent for future constitutional law. Okay, this is a big deal. This paper states that the king is not above the law. No king is above the law. They are subject to the law. Next, it also emphatically states that there should not be any new taxes without approval from the people you're going to tax. And then lastly, it states that kings would not violate the due process of law. So in other words, if your best friend, if the king's best friend is caught stealing something, the king is not going to step in and say, oh, I pardon him. No worries. No, not going to happen. Now, as things are going really, really well, we hit sort of a high point. Struggles begin to come back. The Turks invade the Byzantine Empire in the east. And the Pope in Rome sees this as an opportunity to gain some political clout and power. And so in 1095, Pope Urban calls out for Christians in the Western Empire to go on crusade to take Jerusalem back from the infidel, back from the Muslims. And so the first crusade takes place starting 1095 to 1096. They're able to take Jerusalem in 1099. Now, Pope Urban tells all the people going to war, hey, don't worry about killing people. If you kill people, I absolve you of your sins. No matter what you do, basically you've got a free pass into heaven. Why? Because this is a holy war. You're doing this for God. And since you're doing this for God, all's good. We see some horrible atrocities taking place in the name of God, whether on the Christian side or on the Muslim side. Really, really ridiculous, needless loss of life. There are several other crusades which take place, and none of them are successful for the Europeans. And in 1291, the Muslims were able to gain the last Crusader outpost. And ultimately, that brings us into the late Middle Ages, where we see chaos beginning to reign once more.